nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Shri Radhika-prananatha pāda sarojayo yena premanubhutyasya dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje. Shri Govindam Padarvindam Arupananyabilashojitam Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananam Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payora Shomura Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakszito. Namah Shri Guru Krishnaya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanastrinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambojo Dhulisyam Janma Janmani Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Vilashati Balashvavara Sri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdanta Haichurastam Raganugami Bhajanola Samanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala Shrita Cheta Samme Chittam Satam Marukari Yatupada Padme Bhaktirya Nikilarta Varga Janani Ya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishaya Jat Sukyat Vimuktiryaya Shri Radha Ramanam Param Bhaja Yugam Yasya Mahanashrayo Ya Karya Vrajalokavat Gurutara Premnaiva Tasyai Namah Ya Ramya Nikilagha Sanga Shamani Shrotra Tritim Sangata Ya Swadhya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriham Ya Dhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Saji Yad Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Swabhajana Vibhajana Prayojana Avatar Prema Purushottam Karuna Mahasagar Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharyas, the fulfiller of his heart's desire on this earth, Sri Rupa Gosvami Prabhupada. Again, today we will continue our discussion of Padyavali. And today we begin a new prakaran, Bhagavad-dharma-tattva, or the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma. So we have a verse here which covers a number of important principles in this regard. And we will have some extended discussion of these topics. This verse is essentially like a list of subject matters, and then each subject matter will go through with some analysis with relevant portions from the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, the Brihad Bhagavatamrita, the Satsandarbha, and other works. And this verse that we'll discuss is cited by Jiva Gosvami, by Rupa Goswami, by Sanatana Gosvami, by Vishwanath Chakravarti in various places in their writings. So woven in and essentially built out from the various instances where they cite this verse and give some different application of it, then the discussion that we'll go into in the coming readings has been unfolded from there, so to speak, and expanded with relevant subject matter in those contexts or in other contexts that will enrich our understanding of them, or which further elaborate or clarify the subject matter. So the first topic that's taken up in the verse, and that which we'll dive into, is what could be called Vigraha-tattva, or about how to perceive and duly regard the deity, the image of Sri Bhagavan. So that is where we will go first. But the commentator, interestingly, gives a recap of all of the sections so far in the Padyavali before entering into his discussion of this verse. So we'll look at that recap, and then we'll come to Bhagavad-dharma-tattva. So, next, the compiler begins a section on the essential nature of Sri Bhagavad-dharma. Prior to discussion of this section, the commentator offers a review of the content presented thus far in Padyavali. 1. The greatness of Sri Krishna and worship of him was presented for those in whom Baba has not manifested, who might be called ajata bhava or ajata rati sadhakas. And the fortune of prema was presented en passant. So the idea is that if someone already has bhava, they don't need to read this book to be taught what it is. So therefore he's saying that these things are mainly for the audience, is those who don't have this, so that they can understand, aspire for, and be blessed to attain that. So it begins with the greatness of Krishna and the worship of Krishna, as well as discussion of prema. Then the greatness of Sri Bhagavan's name was presented, such as its being the foremost means of purification of the psyche, meaning chitta shuddhi, along with instructions in regard to the manner in which kirtan of the name is to be performed. Then the greatness of discussion of Sri Krishna was discussed. Then instructions in regard to meditation on Sri Bhagavan were presented for those whose psyche has been purified by means of hearing in kirtan. So here the commentator is picking up a point in the Bhakti Sandarbha, where Jiva Gosvami explains that smaranam is antakarana shuddhi or antakarana sapeksha, meaning it can only be effectively or practically performed to the extent that purification of the psyche or chitta shuddhi has been accomplished. So thus first Shravan Kirtan was discussed, and then meditation was discussed so the commentator is saying the import is that Shravan Kirtan is more accessible, more fundamental, and then for those who engage in that and acquire purification of the mind, obviously in most cases, a gradual process, then more and more they become capable of a certain degree of smarana or meditation. So then Sri Krishna's, and dhyan rather is also the word used there. Then Sri Krishna's affection for his bhaktas was discussed. Then the greatness of association with bhaktas and the cause of association with them was discussed. Then specification was given of entreaties of Sri Bhagavan, meaning loosely prayers to him. Then expressions of bhaktas' humility, dainya, were presented. Then bhaktas' fixity in Bhagavan was discussed, with the intent that fixity in Sri Bhagavan shall come about after the cessation of anarthas, as a result of engagement in hearing kirtan and meditation with humility and entreaties of Sri Bhagavan. So he's drawing this out practically here, the commentator. So he's saying if Rupa Goswami mentions Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, Dhyan, and then speaks about Mahatsanga, and then about prayers to Bhagavan, and about humility, then the idea is that all of these things are meant to be compounded. So the person will engage in hearing, in chanting, in remembering, and they'll do so with humility, and this will lead to the anartha nivritti, and consequently nishta. So humility, prayer, coupled with Shravan, Kirtan, Smaran, like that. So he's seeing it from a practical lens, if you will. Then Bhakta's prayers full of eagerness and longing, or utsukya and utkanta, were presented with the intent that these manifest only in those in whom Bhava has manifested, following attachment and taste for Sri Bhagavan that manifest after fixity in Bhagavan, as was discussed earlier. Then disregard for moksha was discussed, which emerges from utkanta for Sri Bhagavan. The compilers, so this whole analysis that the compiler is giving is based on this famous verse in the Sindhu, as well as another that comes a little bit later, both of which are cited in the Charitamrita. The commentator also cites the following two passages from the compiler's Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu for reference in regard to the reasoning behind the structuring of the content here in Padyavali. So he's interpreting it that Rupa Goswami structured these things in a way that parallels this general progression that he outlines in the Sindhu. So this first verse, Ado Shraddha Tata Sadhu Sango Tata Bhajana Kriya Tato Narta Nivritti Syat Tato Nishta Ruchis Tata Ata Suktis Tato Bhavas Tata Prema Bhu Danchati Sarakanam Ayam Premna Pradurbhave Bhavet Krama. At first, Shraddha, then Sadhu Sangha, then Bhajana Kriya, then Anartha Nivritti, then Nishta, then Ruchi, then Asakti, then Bhav, and then Prema appear. These are the stages in the appearance of Prema for a sadhaka. So one point of note that's valuable in regard to this verse is that all of this is described as a manifestation coming to the sadhaka. So this sometimes this verse is interpreted to be like a set of levels that one advances through or that one achieves. And it can, you could see it like that, but it's the underlying import when you understand the other points that Rupa Goswami makes, such as in the 3rd and 4th verse of the 3rd chapter, where he speaks about how Bhava Bhakti is constituted of the Sarup Shakti and how it then manifests into the vrittis of the mind. The idea is that all of these things are the gradual intensification of the presence and the flourishing influence of the Sarup Shakti over the psyche. So they all are essentially, what can you say, endowments of grace that are becoming more and more rich in their expression and in their effect and in the experience that they give rise to. So this is one point to see the verse in the context of the broader teachings that it's set within. And then this verse comes near the very end of the first division of the Sindhu, and then very shortly thereafter that, at the very beginning of the next division, then we get the following verse, which is also very valuable, in which explains essentially, overviews how it is that rasa is experienced. So the first verse is showing, okay, in this way prema comes to manifest, and then the import is, and then when that prema has manifested, then one will have this experience of rasa. So he overviews that, slightly, overlapping with some of the previous description as follows. Bhakti nirdhutta doshanam prasanojjala chetasam Śrī Bhagavad-dharma-tattva Rasika-rangada-tika Jivani bhutta govinda pāda bhakti sukha shriyam premantaranga bhutani krityanyeva anutishtitam bhaktanam hridi rajanti samskara yugalojjala ratirananda rupaiva niyamana turasyatam krishnadibir vibhavadyair gattair anubhavadvani prodhananda chamatkara kashtam apadyate param. In the hearts of bhaktas who have been purified by bhakti of all faults, meaning attachment, aversion, delusion, etc., or, anarthas collectively, however you want to categorize it, who as a result, whose hearts are clear. So by clear, the commentary explains, fit for a manifestation of higher pure existence, what is called viṣṇuddha-sattva viṣesh. So essentially that means bhava bhakti, prema bhakti, a direct, you could say full-scale manifestation of the Swarup Shakti of Bhagavan. So that occurs once the faults are removed. So to remove the faults, the full dose isn't required, just some initial heat there can melt the ice, so to speak, and then once the ice is clear, then the full installation can come in, so to speak. And so the heart becomes clear, means fit for this manifestation, and bright. That is all-knowing by virtue of this manifestation. So it's purified, it's then clear, and then it becomes bright, or it becomes full and enriched with the presence of that Shuddha Sattva Vishesh, or of that Bhava Bhakti. So these persons, their hearts are purified, their hearts are clear, their hearts are bright, and they are they who cherish relishing Srimad Bhagavatam, who rejoice in the company of relishers of rasa, whose life is the wealth of the bliss of bhakti to the feet of Govinda, meaning who don't think or pursue anything apart from bhakti, who are deeply steeped in the experience of the bliss of bhakti, and who engage in all of prema's natural activities, meaning everything that prema inspires is observable in their speech, in their conduct, etc. So in that person, what happens? Rati, or synonym with bhav in this context in the Sindhu, Rati, which is bliss itself, appears bright as a result of the two types of samskaras. So the commentator explains, meaning Jiva Gosvami, impressions in the psyche made by pure bhakti in one's previous births and one's present birth. And this is explained in a subsequent verse in the Sindhu also. So one has the vasana, or the samskar rather, which he here uses the term vasana and samskar synonymously. And then on the basis of that, the rati, which is bliss itself, produces its effect. What does it do? It reaches the state of being rasa, or being relishable, on the pathway of perception. So here pathway is metaphoric uses, it just means is perceived in the mind as such. In other words, rati becomes rasa, or rati gives rise to the experience of rasa at this stage within the mind, on account of present vibhavas and so forth, meaning the other requisites of rasa, anubhavas, sattvika bhavas, vyabhichari bhavas, beginning with Krishna, the Vishaya-avalambana vibhava, meaning when Rupa Goswami delineates these four categories, the very first category he takes up is the Vishaya-avalambana vibhava, which is Krishna, or the primary object of the bhakti that is relished, the rasa of which is being relished. So when rasa emerges in the presence of all of its constituents, and then what happens? It reaches the highest pinnacle of intense bliss and wonder. So in the one sense, Rupa Goswami's entire project is summarized in this set of verses. The whole experience that's had, and also the process by which it's had, and the elements by which it takes place. All of these things are overviewed here. So the commentator is thus saying that this progression that we've gone through in the Padyavali so far is meant to lead someone to having this experience. So Rupa Goswami, with this in mind, is compiling all these verses from all these earlier writers, adding in a few of his own on all of these relevant categories to facilitate the transformation of the psyche as is described here. So this is also nice to be reminded of. I think most persons who study a text like this are already well acquainted with these points, but nevertheless to be reminded of what all is being cultivated here, and also perhaps also to remind us of, or to highlight where we might improve in our attempts by remembering what is this process we're aspiring to precipitate in our life. So, with all this reflection in place, in this way of reviewing the content of Padyavali presented thus far, the commentator reasons that the next section on the essential nature of Sri Bhagavad-dharma is presented out of the consideration that bhakti pleasing to Sri Bhagavan cannot be performed without knowledge of the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma. So this is a nice point, that anyone can do bhakti whether they know it or not. The example of the person who spent the whole night in the tree crying, fasting after an argument, and just so happened in the dark to be shedding tears on top of the Shiva lingam that they didn't know was there, was, got credited, so to speak, for performing a great act of bhakti, of fasting all night and bathing the Shiva lingam with tears. But they weren't fasting on purpose. They were fasting out of anger because they had a fight and couldn't go home. And they didn't know that they were bathing the lingam, and they weren't crying about Shiva. So, Shiva Thakur is Ashutosh, and Krishna also is easily pleased by sincere or, simple-hearted acts, even unintentional acts of bhakti. But here he's saying Sri Bhagavat Santoshika Bhakti, but bhakti that is pleasing to Bhagavan. So, loosely speaking, any act of bhakti is pleasing to Bhagavan, but here the commentator means in a substantial sense, or in a pronounced sense, just as, in life, if someone, sends you a bouquet of flowers, and you receive the flowers and you think, oh, it's so nice this person gave me these flowers. Then if they come along and say, oh, those flowers are with you? Oh, I didn't even know they were going to come to you. Then it's not really as satisfying as when the person said, oh, I went and picked these flowers and I arranged them and I'm so glad that you like them. And when you know that it was done intentionally for the, as a gesture for them, there's a far greater degree of satisfaction when you're aware of the amount of thought, effort, care, attention, etc. that went into it. So in that sense, the commentator is saying that to please Bhagavan with our observance of activities of bhakti or of Bhagavad-dharma, then we need to know how to do that. We need to know what Bhagavad-dharma is. That knowledge will give us the ability to do these things consciously, to do these things attentively, sensitively, caringly. It will enrich greatly the extent to which those acts can become meaningful in the way that they're offered, and also in the depth, to the extent to which they're perceived and received by Bhagavan. So this is a very important point, and we see that no doubt our Goswamis spent a lot of time helping us understand what is the meaning, so to speak, of performing an act of bhakti. They spent time, delineating and meticulously categorizing all these different acts. But if anything, we can say that above all, they spoke to what it means to perform an act of bhakti and how we can ultimately come to perform it with the greatest richness of heart, with the greatest value or depth of meaning behind whatever act it may be. So in that sense, the commentator is saying that Rupa Goswami adds this section, which you might say is a little bit out of context, because he explained what you might call more general topics about performing acts like discussing Krishna or praising Krishna earlier on, and shortly after this he launches into all these subject matters about Brajadham, and then just before this he's spoken about expressions of longing and eagerness, and so suddenly to come to this, you could say, more technical point, and then the verse has a bit of a stark tone to it. It almost is a little bit jarring in the progression. So my 2 cents is that the commentator maybe went a little long on his not long in a negative sense, but he put a longer intro and gave broader context to the introduction of this section to preclude that impression that it's sort of how it fits into the thought progression is it's not kind of immediately seems to be in the same line of thought or progression or tune, if you will. You might have expected it to come earlier, in other words. So he's taking it like this, which is a nice way of taking it. So I've given his whole angle of vision on it. All right, so now we come to the verse. Ata Śrī Bhagavad-dharma-tattvam. Now the essential nature of Śrī Bhagavad-dharma. Arcye viṣṇau śilā dhīr guruṣu nara matir vaiṣṇave jāti buddhiḥ viṣṇor vaiṣṇavānāṁ kalimala mathane pāda tīrthe'mbu buddhiḥ Śrī Viṣṇor nāmni mantre sakala kaluṣa shabda samanya buddhir viṣṇau sarve shvareshe taditara samadhir yasyava narakisa. So there's a long parallel construction. It says, one who, in regard to a deity of Viṣṇu, has the thought of a stone. In regard to gurus, the idea of a man. In regard to a Vaiṣṇava, the notion of a caste. In regard to the sacred foot wash of Viṣṇu or the Vaiṣṇavas, which is a destroyer of the contamination of Kali, the thought of water. In regard to the name of Śrī Viṣṇu in a mantra, which is a vanquisher of all sin, the notion of an ordinary word. Or in regard to Viṣṇu, who is the Ishvara of all Ishvaras, the thought of equality with those other than him, is situated in Naraka. So, essentially, a list of frowned upon mentalities, or what you might call, for lack of a better word, misconceptions. If you have these misconceptions, then you're going to miss out, to put it a little softly. So now, like the first topic, one who, in regard to the deity of Vishnu, has the thought of a stone, is situated in Naraka. One in regard to gurus has the idea of a man, is situated in Naraka. This is how the construction follows through the whole verse. So we'll now go, as we discuss this, point by point, and have a discussion of Vigraha-tattva, then a discussion of Guru-tattva, then a discussion of what you might call Vaishnava-tattva, and also related to that, understanding of caste and how caste is to be understood in the context of Vaishnava practice, and these other topics that come in the verse. So that will be our format and the roadmap, if you will, for the coming discussion. In this verse, the author teaches the essential nature of Sri Bhagavad-dharma by means of negation, that is, by centering attitudes that are opposite to the attitudes that are integral to aptly practicing Bhagavad-dharma. So the point is not just to not think it's something that it's not. The point is to conceive it as it's meant to be conceived. So this is what you call jāti among two different pedagogical methods of saying what it is that someone should do and then saying what it is that someone ought not to do. So by negating what is fit to be negated, you also ensure that the person has an ideal means to engage in what ought to be done. So this is the perspective of the verse, is it's not just negating things for the sake of negation, but it's negating them for the sake of guiding people towards what is ideally to be conceived. So that's what we'll discuss in the commentary, is both why these different notions that are spoken of in the verse are problematic, and then, perhaps most importantly, what is the ideal understanding that the verse is hoping that we'll arrive at by avoiding what is to be avoided. So, when he says when he says that those who lack these attitudes are, quote, situated in Naraka, or Naraki, the sense can be taken in accord, with Bhagavan Sri Krishna's concise definition. Quote, Naraka is an exceedance of darkness, tamas. Meaning, those who lack the attitudes required to aptly practice Bhagavad-dharma exist in a state of ignorance and suffering. So the word Naraka is loosely equivalent to, in English, what people call hell. So a Naraki can also mean someone who's damned. In other words, someone who's fit to go to hell or who's already in hell. So you could turn this statement into a sort of fire and brimstone intimidating statement, saying, if you think that deity is stone, you're damned and going to hell. You could you could scare somebody, or you could, either of hell or of you by giving a translation and a passionate, promulgation of the statement like that. So I'm electing not to thump it in that way. So first of all, it's relevant that in the Bhagavatam itself, the idea of Naraka is not necessarily always equivalent. Let me go back a step. In the Bhagavatam, there are descriptions of 21 or 27 Narakas, of these states where persons are subjected to, extremely painful forms of punishment for various sins that are committed and so on. Those things are undoubtedly described in the Bhagavatam. There's no doubt about it that they're described there. Now, some are inclined to a less literal reading of those planes, and perhaps lean towards the description being more intended as a deterrent, and others may take them more literally. I'm not here to tell anyone how they have to think in that regard, But what's also relevant is that later in the 11th canto, Bhagavan Sri Krishna also makes a remark when he's giving these very concise answers to a long series of questions from Uddhava. What is dharma? What is wealth? What is good? Sort of general concepts like this. When he's asked what is naraka, then he says this. He says naraka is an exceedance of tamas. Or in other words, hell means ignorance. So that means that, hell isn't necessarily what a place one goes to after leaving this body to suffer, but it's something one exists in right now if one hasn't been blessed with the education and doesn't have the previous psychic conditioning to be free from being covered over by some or a heavy degree of darkness. So by saying and by understanding the verse here, naraki, to mean someone who's under an exceedance of darkness, then the verse essentially means one who thinks, or one who has the notion of a stone in relation to Vishnu is situated in darkness, essentially just means that they're in the dark, they don't have an accurate understanding of how this is meant to be conceived by a follower of the path of bhakti. So in that way, you can take it in what might be arguably a practical, more direct way of explaining the point in a way that will lead to someone inquiring as to how they can refine their understanding, as opposed to just being scared or intimidated into thinking that they're in a wrongful state and now become worried about their future or something like this. Practically speaking, the sooner they can become receptive to and acquire an improved understanding, the brighter and more efficiently their spiritual prospect on the path of bhakti unfolds accordingly. So, I don't mean to go into the whole side of how we want to look at hell and things like that. That's not a topic that I've gone into in detail here. I've just focused on how we can understand Bhagavad-dharma. So we'll touch this a little bit, but for the most part we'll go into the rest of the content in the verse. So, naraka is an exceedance of darkness, meaning those who lack the attitudes required to aptly practice Bhagavad-dharma exist in a state of ignorance and suffering. Moreover, because their ignorance leaves them prone to committing offenses or aparad to the deity of Sri Bhagavan, his bhaktas, and other objects worthy of the highest honor, and thus leaves them prone to undergoing the consequences of such offenses, the term naraki can also be understood to convey the sense of one being liable of going to naraka. Meaning, if one has this lack of understanding, there isn't a deterrent, or there isn't an internal mechanism that's going to prevent someone from doing something that will result in aparad, will result in an action, the consequence of which can be, a state of acute suffering. So in that sense, one who lacks this understanding can be understood not necessarily as someone who's, quote, in naraka now, but who's liable of going there. So the term naraki can also mean that, means, as they said, in earlier, centuries in Christian, someone who's damned, so to speak, meaning on the way to hell, so to speak, is, more or less literally what the word naraki means, but we want to nuance our understanding of it a little bit more. So, Kaviraj Goswami Pad speaks of this sense of the term in a description he offers of the celebrated deity of Sri Govinda at the Yog Pit in Sri Vrindavan. So, when he's describing his own life experience, how he received the grace of Nityananda Prabhu, how he came to Braj, how he got the association of the Goswamis. When he's reflecting on all these wonderful blessings in his life, then he also reflects on how he got to worship and have darshan of Govinda and conceive of the whole Mahayogpit and Vrindavan Dham. So in that regard he says, Sakshat Brajendra Sutta ite nahiyan Jeba agye kore tare pratimadi gyan Seyaparaditar nahika nistar Ghor narakate pore ki boliboar. He is the son of Braja's king himself. There is nothing else to be thought in this regard. For one who in ignorance considers him merely an image or otherwise, there is no deliverance from that offense. One falls into dark naraka. What more shall I say? So one other consideration, perhaps a historical or contextual consideration, is that in this era, there already had been sieges of Mathura in the 15th century prior to the arrival of Mahaprabhu or Bhugarbha Goswami and Lokanath Goswami or anyone of the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, so to speak. In the 30, 40 years earlier, there had been a massive siege of Mathura, and almost all of the major temples in the region and in the city had been desecrated and partially or completely destroyed. So this, and then, as we know, in the centuries thereafter, many of the deities that the Goswamis revealed, as well as others that they worshipped, were hidden or taken away. Some of the temples were desecrated. So this was also a period of time where there was a very real threat to the safety of these deities as well as their worshippers, and the reality of the mentality that these were stone objects which were fit to be and ought to be destroyed was a very serious reality in that social context. And obviously it still is in today's world in certain regions. In India, in the last couple of centuries, we haven't, since the British lost power, or even in the last century of their power, it was, diminished significantly. We do hear of the British having destroyed some of the deities that Narottam Thakur established in the northeast, even into the late 1800s. But I just bring this historical context to say that perhaps some of this heaviness of language that's used in our verse of discussion, as well as used by Kaviraj Goswami, is also, in one sense, a defense mechanism within the culture to set a boundary and set a standard of sanctity for these things, both for the insiders of the tradition as well as the outsiders, to know that in this tradition, whether you accept it or not, this is something of the highest degree of sanctity, and it is considered supremely offensive or disrespectful or iconoclast literally to desecrate these things. So some of that language can also be there for the purpose of protecting the deity and of protecting the worshippers, both by giving them a sense of how deeply they can hold to their faith in this practice, as well as understand how much they're expected also to protect these things. And we do hear historically of people who have laid their lives down, to try to protect their deities. I remember hearing in the 1990s during the abuse that took place of many of the Hindus in Kashmir, there were Kashmiri Pandit Brahmins who, had their temples sieged, and who just, when people are running at them with weapons, just ran and hugged their Shiva Lingam or their Thakur and were killed, just holding on, so to speak. So, persons have that level of faith. And in one sense, some have argued that Hindu thought has a deep type of regenerative or resilient ethos, in that people who have this type of faith know that even if they're killed protecting their faith or protecting the deity or sticking to their ideals, that they'll live again. They have complete conviction that you can't really kill me and you can't really stamp out this culture. You can suppress it for some time, but ultimately you'll get the karma for what you're doing, and I'll also be reborn and have the chance to continue doing what I'm doing. And I forget where I heard, but I remember one, I think he was a rabbi, like a European scholar, I think he was also a rabbi, who had praised this as a feature of Hindu thought and one of its, resiliencies, which is unique in the sense that of all regions that withstood, almost 1,000 years of foreign rule and occupation, and yet how resilient the religious culture of the region. No doubt it transformed greatly in the process, but certain core principles and many of the cultural norms endured. All of that part of that resiliency came from the concept of reincarnation and the eternality of self and the ultimate just administration of the consequences of individual actions, and that can give people a certain level of conviction in a process that makes it hard to scare them out of or easily pull them away from. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. I'm just offering this, for here where Kaviraj Goswami, because in our Goswami literature you see quite rarely that there's any kind of attempt to belittle or use fear as a mode of coercion or persuasion, or create an injunctive sense for why one ought to take up the path of bhakti. You can clearly see that this is not a central feature that they're stressing. You can find statements to the effect, there's the idea that it's a fault not to observe either bhakti or varnashram. Kaviraj Goswami writes a little heavily in that context, something we discussed earlier in the Charitamrita. It's not that it's not there, but it's certainly less pronounced than what we see in the norms of certain other sects in Abrahamic traditions and so forth. So that we do see some of this coming out here, so to speak, is it may have some of its roots in some of the strife or the cultural clash that has taken place around these differences in sensibility about how the imperceptible, immaterial divine is best worshipped, either in an image or not in an image, and as traditions have historically for millennia now disagreed on this subject matter, and aren't gonna end up all thinking the same way anytime soon. It's interesting that both have use of very strong rhetoric. Essentially, you could boil down the view of certain Abrahamic viewpoints to, if you worship an image, you're going to hell, and this statement that we're reading here of, if you don't respect the image, you're going to hell. So you're either going to hell for doing it or not doing it. So it forces the issue, if you will. Now, there is a way to reconcile this and say that the way that's being censured for not respecting the deity and the way that's being censured for respecting the deity actually don't refer to the same attitudes, but the cultural context of the censure upon image worship that you find in Moses' commandments, that the censure of the image worship in that culture, in that context, is not actually the same image worship that you might find in the Gaudiya Vaishnava context or in other sampradayas of Hinduism of later centuries. So you can also make the case that there isn't just a clash in this regard, but if there can be a nuanced understanding where there doesn't need to be read as just a black and white, this is irreconcilable, but rather you could not worship the image as it's forbidden to be worshipped on one side, and you can also revere the image as it's meant to be, without contradicting the other. So that's, a broader topic. I don't want to, I'm already digressing, I don't want to keep digressing anymore. So coming back to Kaviraj Goswami, I'll just read this one more time. He writes in regard to Govinda at the Yog Pit in Vrindavan, the same Govinda that Rupa Goswami read, don't go down and see him. So, he is the son of Braja's king himself. There is nothing else to be thought in this regard. For one who in ignorance considers him merely an image or otherwise, there is no deliverance from that offense. One falls into dark naraka. What more shall I say? Here, Sri Kaviraj Goswami Pad refers to the first of the attitudes that is condemned in the verse under discussion. Quote, one who, in regard to a deity of Viṣṇu, has the thought of a stone. Arcye viṣṇau śilā dhīr. Meaning one who considers that a deity of Viṣṇu is merely a piece of stone or another earthly material, and not a manifest form of Sri Bhagavan, who is of the essential nature of eternal being, consciousness, and bliss. Thus, the attitude required to aptly engage in Bhagavad-dharma, which is referred to in this case, is the attitude of considering deities of Sri Bhagavan to be manifest forms of Sri Bhagavan that are constituted of eternal being, consciousness, and bliss, rather than mere images made of stone or other earthly materials. It is not, however, that a follower of Bhagavad-dharma is nevertheless not aware that a deity of Sri Bhagavan is visibly or apparently made up of a particular material, such as wood or stone, even as they see the deity to be a manifest form of Bhagavan, constituted of eternal being, consciousness, and bliss. This is so because none other than Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself, in the course of teaching the practice of worshipping deities in Srimad Bhagavatam, classifies them as being made of 8 different materials. So this is interesting. Right? Krishna himself says, Shaili darumayi lohi lepya lekya chasaikati manomayi monimayi pratima ashtabidha smrita. An image, or a deity, pratima, is known to be of 8 types: stonen, wooden, metallic, molded, drawn, or painted, arenaceous, mental, or jeweled. When Bhagavan Sri Krishna himself teaches that deities are made of these 8 different materials, one may wonder why then it is considered an offense to think a deity is made of stone or any such material. So this is, this is me, I'm just drawing this contrast. So the verse is saying, if you think the deity is made of stone, you're going to hell. And then Krishna himself says, some deities are made of stone. So, Bhagavan himself, he whose deity we're talking about, is also saying that deities of me are made of stone. But if you think it's made of stone, you're going to hell. But Bhagavan himself told me it's made of stone. This would be the objection. So how can we rectify what this this verse that we're talking about here, it's of anonymous authorship. It's just attributed to a southerner. So also then, we can remember, this isn't a direct statement of the Shastra. We can also consider what's being said a little bit loosely if it appears to contradict something like a statement from the mouth of Krishna in the Bhagavatam, which would have very high epistemological weight, we would say that, okay, if we give precedence to the weight of Krishna's statement, that we can understand that a deity is made of stone. But if this is saying we shouldn't think it's made of stone, then obviously this means we shouldn't think it's only made of stone, or we should see something complementary to that or in consonance with that, but not that we can never possibly say or speak or think that way, because if we were to ever stop to say or speak that way, we wouldn't be able to read this verse in the Bhagavatam. So, the answer to this query can be found in Bhagavan Sri Krishna's subsequent statement. Quote, an establishment, pratishta, so this is another word he uses for a deity, that is a dwelling place of life. Now, it's a little bit of kind of abstract language. He's calling it a Jiva Mandiram. So Jiva Gosvami, he gives extended commentary on this because the language is a bit, not exactly cryptic, but it's a little bit vague. So he clarifies that when Krishna himself uses the word Jiva here, he's actually talking about himself, or Bhagavan, or capital Jiva, like life, meaning he from whom all life comes, or he who is the essence of life. So a quote, establishment or deity is a dwelling place of life, meaning a dwelling place of Bhagavan, and is of two types, permanent and impermanent. So, regarding this little, meaning brief statement, Jiva Goswami has plenty to say. But I think we're just about out of time for today, so I'll leave you on the edge of the cliff. How do we reconcile this statement of Krishna with the statement in the verse, and how can we understand that its deity is both made of consciousness and made of stone, and not go to hell in the process? So, hope nobody suffers from anxiety until we get to the next discussion. Just kidding. So I'll conclude here. If anyone has any comments, questions, corrections, or other feedback, please feel free to share. Yes.
Jai Radhe, Pranamo.
Jai Radhe, Pranam.
First of all, thank you so much. Love the digressions. Were actually very informative, so appreciate them.
Okay.
So my question specifically then, and I'm guessing it's going to come up in the next section, but talking about what you were mentioning about Naraka and kind of like the motivations perhaps for statements like this, and who the audience or the intended audience might be. So there's certainly people who might benefit from some measurement of fear, perhaps just to give them a push. But I'm guessing this is more to help people avoid aparadha, precisely for in the practice of bhakti. So I remember, and I would like some clarification, there's perhaps a commentary by Jiva Gosvami where this aparadhas, if they are perhaps unintentional or done out of ignorance, maybe they won't be such an obstacle, and through the practice of bhakti, some they might be clear, like or destroyed eventually. But those who are intentional, they do become a strong obstacle in the life of a sadhaka. So in this case, it seems like, so is the intention to prevent this sort of attitude where it is an intentional offense. Like this is, like you were saying, this is just a piece of stone. There's no need to worship, or there's no need to engage in this sort of practice, or you can focus on something else, or kind of in that sense. Because you were mentioning like some attitudes that may have existed in this time as well. So I don't know if I'm actually making the point. So the idea is here, or the audience is those type of people, or is it a general for even unintentional offenses? What would you say in this regard?
Well, I believe the Goswamis wrote in a way that was intended for posterity. So, arguably anyone writing for posterity their view can't be completely uncolored by their immediate context and what posterity foreseeably will be like from, the circumstances in which they wrote. But we see that generally the Goswamis have written quite, in a principled, very organized manner to create a framework, if you will, of understanding. And so by including statements like this in their works, they're undoubtedly laying down a very, important barrier, or a very important rule here, that in their view, the bhakta will show the utmost regard for the deity. And as we'll get to, Rupa Goswami praises worship of the deity as one of the most powerful of all bhakti sadhanas. So, in one sense, this warning or this strictness or heaviness regarding disrespect of the deity can also be seen as a parallel expression for the depth of faith and the depth of love that they have for this practice. Just as the whole concept of aparad, why is aparad so problematic? Why is Bhagavan so upset by Vaishnava aparad? Because he loves Vaishnavas so much, right? So the severity of the consequences of aparad are also a measure or an index of the depth of Bhagavan's love for Vaishnavas. So similarly, if these bhaktas are speaking about the detrimental consequences of desecrating the deity, we can also understand that means the benefit of adoring the deity is proportionately so powerful and so wonderful. And so to protect people from losing that chance, so to speak, then this type of language, this type of serious, line in the ground, so to speak, is laid down. So, I'm just throwing in the cultural context or the historical context and saying that when you live in an age where temples are already known to have been ruggedly sieged, and in which such things, the threat of which is nevertheless evident even at the time of the writing, then to retain this level of understanding, by, in other words, putting in this rule that, desecrating deities like this has this offense, in one way that can have a political implication, because the kshatriyas of this era, who are patrons of this dharma, then who take it upon themselves to protect this dharma, then know that anyone who does this is so deeply offending the dharma or offending the culture that it's our duty to now protect these deities, to protect and prevent such tragedies from happening. And we see that, the Rajas of Jaipur took and accepted many of the deities from Vrindavan. So these type of statements, they have, a lot of weight, so to speak, in the preservation or the protection of the culture of image worship in the context of, colonization and, imperialism and those kind of things. So to what extent exactly, these things were penned in a politically or culturally defensive attempt on that scale, or whether it was also just on a village level that people would learn to grow up with respect for deities. Obviously I think both were there, and I'm not going to make an argument for it being more or less, or has to be this or has to be that. I'm inclined to think that there may have been some coloring of all of the above in the inspiration for these type of statements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it, like you were saying, it seems like if they thought it was important enough to include it in works that were going to be read by bhaktas or were, directed at bhaktas, that there was a concern for perhaps people becoming too, or taking this too lightly, perhaps, the attitudes towards the deity. Thank you so much. Just one last question about what you were saying in reference to the concept of naraka. I know you mentioned some opinions that were more inclined to take it as a metaphorical, or doing a metaphorical interpretation of this. Is there a reference to the commentaries that you can remember at this time? Maybe in that section of the Bhagavata?
Not off the top of my head, an exact
No problem.
an exact regard on the 5th canto there. I'd have to look it up to give you something precise.
Okay, no problem. All right, I think that's the other questions. I think will come up in the next section.
Yeah, we're gonna go into some nitty gritty on this subject matter. So Jiva Goswami will give a few interpretations of this, and then there's an extended prakaran in the Bhagavad-dharma-tattva where many subjects come up regarding this, and we'll go on and on. So I hope people are ready for some discussion of deities for some days to come.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Cheers. Yes.
Jai Radhe. Pranam Baba.
Jai Radhe.
I wanted to just clarify if I understood it correctly, also in regard to like when, for example, person finds even in this life his mind being in the state of naraka-like for some reason, probably because the aparat was committed. So in that case, is it right that one shouldn't consider it to be like a punishment, in a sense, like not only I will go to naraka in my afterlife, but even in this life I will experience naraka life, like bad experience or something, but it should be considered like as a grace of Bhagavan, as a chance to refine one's understanding. And if one is able to, like, by the influence of sattva guna somehow refine this understanding and redeem in this life, he will be like freed of these consequences of whatever aparat one has committed. Is it like should it be like seen as a grace of Bhagavan, that Bhagavan is so gracious that he gives a chance for the person to, like, even in this life, to like free himself or herself of the influence of that aparat which was committed? Is that correct?
Yeah, I think can be seen that way. The only thing I would critique is just, you mentioned the role of sattva-gun, and I would say in this context it would be more the role of the acquisition of knowledge of the essential nature of Bhagavad-dharma, or the knowledge that's coming through these shastras, that's coming through the sampradaya, that will give one the understanding by which one can replot one's course and redirect the focus of one's mind. So what you can say coextensive with that, you could say, is the presence of a more sattvic sattvic state of mind as well. That's also there. It's just we wouldn't say that it's sattva gun itself that's leading to the dissipation of the aparad. We would say that the dissipation of the aparad as well as the upwelling of the sattva gun would both be coming under as in the wake of the purifying influence of bhakti, the purifying influence of Bhagavan's grace. But I'm just critiquing one side of it. In general, what you said was perfectly fine.
So it means that only the influence of the nirgun plane can free one of that state. Is that would be more?
Right, generally speaking, and just the principle being that, the relief from the effect of the action will come from the affected object. So, loosely, what we call sin is a transgression within the triguna plane of elements within the trigunas. What we call aparad is something that's not directly pertaining to the trigunas, but is related to Bhagavan, or related to something that's nirguna in essence, as we see it from the bhakti viewpoint. So then it'll be an influence coming also of the nirguna nature in the form of the teaching of the Shastra and so on, that will also lead to the rectification of that.
Understood. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, then we can conclude here for today. And if we're so blessed, then again in our next reading we'll dive further into this interesting and rich subject, which can also give us some fresh, renewed appreciation for our daily deity worship. Vaiṣṇavebhyo namo namah. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Radhe Shyam.
Jai.
Jai Radhe Shyam. Thank you.
Radhe. Thank you.